Well, welcome back to session 2. This session is, again, we're talking about the faith with regard to communion, right? We're looking at what the faith really is with respect to communion. Last time we talked about the understanding of faith from the perspective of the important questions, and we saw that really relationships, and we talked about relationships of communion as being those that were of primary concern, really fundamentally what it is that we're created for. So communion, we had said, was a relationship, and a relationship of disinterested love, right? It's a relationship of communion to the degree that we are in it for the good of the others. To the degree that we fall short of that, to the degree that we were in those relationships for our own sake, for our own benefit, we actually, we deprive ourselves. We really deprive ourselves of really what it is that we are created for. Communion, therefore, is really to be understood from the perspective of who we are in relationship with God. Now, we're going to talk about the idea of communion in this segment from the perspective of the acts of communion. In some ways, we're kind of leaping ahead of where we are going to end up getting, but I think in this regard, it's very helpful because I think that one of the things that we really need to discuss before we get further along is really the idea of faith. What is faith? Because faith seems to be very difficult for us today. Faith ultimately can be understood as an act of communion. And since we're talking about faith as an act of communion, it's good to look at the other 3 primary acts of communion. The other act of communion we could call hope. And the third act of communion, of course, is love. We've already mentioned that in the first section. These 3, as we will find out as we go along, are actually also called the theological virtues. We're going to look at them a little bit from that perspective, but primarily we're going to look at them today from the perspective of communion. So let's look at the first. The first element is faith. What is faith? Well, there are many places that we could start, but I think one of those we could look at, and this is something that oftentimes, depending on where we are in our faith, we may not have heard this before. Others of us that have heard this perhaps have accepted it without really even thinking about the significance of it. But Jesus, after his death and resurrection, and before he ascends up into heaven, he tells his disciples something about faith. Right? He tells them something about faith that really I think we should think about because it really can help us. It's in some ways very shocking, I think, but it helps us, I think, understand really the meaning of faith. Now, Jesus, before he died, or before he goes up into heaven, appears to the 11 in the upper room, and they're still at the table. And he tells them that in fact, he upbraids him, Mark says. We'll start this is chapter 16, verse 14. He says, "Afterward, Jesus appeared to the 11 themselves as they sat at table." I said 12, but by this time we're down to 11, right? We know we've lost one. "And he upbraided them for their unbelief and hardness of heart." Right? Jesus is being, in a certain sense, we talked about his tenderness last time, but also his severity. Depending on our perspective, we can see this from both perspectives, right? But he's being, in a certain sense, perhaps a little bit severe with them for their unbelief, their hardness of heart. Now, why is that, do we think? He goes on and gives us a sense of why that might be. The particular instance that he is upbraiding them about is that they had not believed that those who had seen him, right, when they testified to him. This is something that's important for us too, isn't it? Because we haven't seen him directly. We come to know him in a relationship that's in many ways part tangible and part not. We're going to talk about this as we go along. But we have come to believe in him through the witness of others. You see, from these initial witnesses, this has been handed down through word of mouth, right, incarnationally through persons through thousands of years. And he is showing them that if they haven't believed to have seen, right? What kind of chance is there for those who aren't going to see? And this is actually what he told Thomas, right? But then he goes on and says something to him exactly about this particular point. He says, "Go out into all of the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation. He who believes and is baptized will be saved, and he who does not believe will be condemned." Okay, believing and being saved sounds okay, I suppose. But this idea of not believing and being condemned, what is it about belief, right? What is it about faith that can condemn us? Why should we be condemned for not believing? Well, this gives us some insight into what faith really is. It has to give us insight into what faith really is. You see, faith is not just an option, right, on this smorgasbord of options that we have in the creation. It's not, well, no, I prefer this to faith. I prefer, dancing, or I prefer snowboarding, or whatever it is, right? That's just my personality. Faith shows us that faith is something integral to what it means to be human. It has to be. In other words, we have to be anti-human by rejecting faith. It has to go against human nature not to have faith. This is the only reason that we can be condemned, for not being who it is that we are created to be. The other thing about faith that this shows us is that we can only be held responsible for one thing. In all of those things that we do as humans, the one thing, and in a certain sense this is many things as well, but the one thing that we have the capacity to do, right, is to choose freely. Right? It has to be a free act of the will. If it's to be meritorious, right, or to be condemned for it. So we can see that faith, which is belief, is somehow connected to be human. Now, in our society, we've been a little bit misled. And I think that because of this being misled, it's not quite obvious to many of us. And this is something that we need to be aware of when we're approaching others, especially. We have come to think that to be scientific, right, it means to be a skeptic, right? To be skeptical about things, to be suspicious about things. We think we grow up in a world today where being critical means to be suspicious. But I would contend that being suspicious is actually an anti-human attitude. It's an anti-human stance. If we think about our lives, if we kind of audit our lives, we come to recognize that, take an average day, right? We wake up in the morning, and we get up and we perhaps go to our medicine cabinet, pull something, this tube out, and stick it on a brush and stick that in our mouth, right? We don't know, we didn't make that. We accepted it. We trusted, right? We trusted others that this wouldn't kill us, right? That this was actually beneficial to us. And in fact, as we go downstairs and open up the pantry or the refrigerator, we've done even more so, right? We're ingesting things that we haven't been involved in growing, in harvesting and preparing. We trust that it is what it says that it is. We go outside the door in the morning and we trust that when we get in the car and we drive in the world, the other people aren't going to try to kill us, right? Ultimately, there is this, to be able to live in a society, to be able to trust, to be human, right? Because we're made for communion. It begins with this sense of trust. We meet somebody on the street, right? And we don't know who they are from Adam, and we start talking to them, and we actually believe what it is they tell us about themselves. And in fact, if we find out later that they were deceiving us, we're shocked and disappointed. Why? Because more often we believe, we trust, than the opposite. Because that's what it is to be human. in contradiction or contrast to suspicion or skepticism, these, I would say, are the contrary to faith, and they're very caustic to our human personhood, our human personality, primarily because it's a prejudice, it's a bias. It is first choosing an act of the will against the other person, choosing not to believe. And in fact, setting a bar at a certain level, right, that the person is going to have to overcome. And we all know that if we have chosen not to trust somebody, there's almost nothing that person can do to get us to trust them, right? This is really this really interrupts, actually, it prevents the possibility of a relationship, and we're created for relationships. Now, we can make distinctions here between trust, right, in certain circumstances, and I would say prudential caution in others, right? This is a lot different than skepticism. Prudential caution really is recognizing that perhaps the possibility of being deceived is great, right, and or the consequences are grave. In those situations, you might withhold trust. If, for example, someone comes up to you on the street and says they've got $1 million they want to give you, and all you have to do is give them your wallet, so that they can, and then they'll send you a check. Well, in that circumstance, withholding trust makes sense, right? But it's not the same as always being suspicious and skeptical of people. So we can see that fundamentally this openness of attitude, this openness towards other people really is foundational to who we are as human beings. We cannot fulfill ourselves without relationships, authentic relationships. And this openness, this faith, a certain faith, a trust, right, in others. Now, I've kind of more or less mixed together the idea of trust, I think, and faith. Trust is a first step in faith, but when we're talking about real faith, right, faith goes a little bit beyond simply belief, beyond a simple trust, right? Faith is also, as we already pointed out, not just human, but an act of the will. What faith does is it is a commitment to another. When I have faith in another person, I know I am, right, all in. It is this, I have decided this person is worthy of trust. This relationship is of a significant enough gravity for me that in this relationship, this person who is worthy of trust, I am putting my faith into. It comes with a certain amount of risk because we don't know the future, right? None of us know the future. But it is taking that risk, right? It's taking that risk. So faith is ultimately an aspect of a relationship. And I would suggest that to have a relationship of any kind of intimacy requires beyond simple trust, really a commitment of faith in the other person. Right? And this is what we're talking about when we talk about faith in general, but it's what we talk about when we talk about faith in God, faith in Jesus Christ. We have to believe, right? We have to believe the good news, and there's a certain a content associated with that good news, right? It's certain thing. It's really linked to a person. Really, the object of the faith, even all of the things that we talk about as being the good news, the gospel, it really is nothing other than this understanding of who Jesus Christ is, who he is, who we are, and what we're called to believe in, right? It's all of the faith, the entire gospel, the scriptures, the catechism, all of this together, right, is about a person, Jesus Christ. So the object of faith is Jesus Christ, and it is a certain demand upon us, right? There is no maybe. It's either yes or no, and it's yes or no. This is a human aspect of it, right? Of course, faith goes beyond that. Faith in Jesus Christ goes beyond perhaps things that we could even imagine being able to do in terms of what it means to be in this commitment to Jesus Christ. Right? When we talk about love, we'll get a better sense, I think, of why this is. But the epistle to the Hebrews in the New Testament, in chapter 11, there's this great ode to faith. Right? It's almost the entire chapter. It is the entire chapter of chapter 11. We're not going to read through the whole thing, but I want to read a few parts of this because this gives us a sense, really, of what faith is meant to be. It's it begins with a kind of a quasi-definition of faith. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. For by it, men of old received divine approval. By faith, we understand that the world was created by the Word of God, so that what is seen was made out of things which do not appear. He goes on to talk about the faith of Abel, the faith of Enoch, the faith of Noah. He says, by faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called out to go to a place which he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was to go. By faith, he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he looked forward to the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker was God. He goes on talking about in Abraham's entire life of faith. He talks about the faith of Moses. He talks about the faith of David and others. And then he goes on to talk about the faith of those who were all in this very visceral sense. He said, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of David, or of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, of Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, received promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched raging fires, escaped the edge of the sword, won strength out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Women received their dead by resurrection. Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life. Others suffered mocking and scourging, and even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned, they were sawn in two, they were killed by the sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, ill-treated, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering over deserts and mountains and in dens and caves. All of these things, this faith, this commitment to Jesus Christ, ultimately, even in the Old Testament, this faith to this promise of God in the Old Testament was ultimately a faith in Jesus Christ. So faith is this capacity for this commitment. To be sawn in two is not something of a human faith, though. To be able to die for the sake of God, be able to decide for the faith of in Jesus Christ. To be able to do that, and to do that in love, requires a supernatural aspect of it. So faith begins with a human act of saying yes, fully committing to ourselves to Jesus Christ. But it is responded to by God, who gives his very self to us and supernaturalizes this gift. Right? So faith is very human. It's very reasonable. We do it all the time. It is simply that when we have faith in the one who is the origin of faith, the origin of relationships, this origin of all that is, it makes sense to give ourselves completely back to him. And as we go along, we will see why that is. Now, faith is very much linked to another aspect, hope. Hope is another act of communion. Hope is something that with us, right, faith and hope are, in certain sense, two sides of the same coin. Hope is kind of faith with a future orientation, right? There is a human aspect to hope. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? Because human beings, even in the worst of times, have this hope. We assume that things are going to get better. Is it that we are blindly optimistic? G.K. Chesterton said, well, yeah, he said that optimism makes no sense without a theological hope, right? There is really no sense to hope in the future the hope, like faith, has to have an object. Hope can only be in a person. It can't be in some blind energy or some possibilities. But it's really ingrained into who it is we are as human persons. This hope, this theological hope, right? Hope is also a commitment of the will. We don't have hope is again an act of the will, choosing not to have hope like we choose not to have faith. Both of those are acts of the will. And they result in despair, ultimately. But we don't fall into despair without willing it. We do not have faith without choosing, right? Both of these are acts of the will. This is why we're culpable for them. Now, there's a lot more that we have to say with respect to why the particulars of this faith, right, the particulars of the Catholic faith, are believable, are reasonable, and we will touch on those as we go along. But ultimately, they are credible, and we have the capacity to believe in them and to give ourselves to them totally, because it does conform with who we are. God couldn't ask us to do it if it didn't conform to who we are. So hope, again, is this hope ultimately in the promises, right, that Jesus promised us. That through faith in him, giving ourselves completely to him, we will receive ourselves back again, more fully than we have now. And we will be able to, in the fullness of who we are, to be able to spend eternity with him. So, faith, this act of full surrender, complete giving of ourselves, all in with Jesus Christ. Hope, this hope is oriented towards the promises that he's given us, the resurrection and eternal life. But there's this third act of communion that's necessary. Right? This third act of communion that's necessary because faith and hope by themselves are not sufficient. Right? St. Paul tells us that. Right? He talks about the fact that if this passage in 1 Corinthians that is read at most weddings, right? If I have faith, right, of the size of mountains, right, and have not love, it's nothing. St. James says something similar, doesn't he? He says that, that the demons believe, right, and they shudder. He says faith without works, and particular types of works, is dead. So faith alone does not save. Faith alone is not a relationship. We can have complete faith in somebody, right, that they are going to do good to us, and commit ourselves to that completely without giving ourselves back. And if we take, but we don't give, there is no relationship. Giving ourselves in this relationship, giving ourselves fully in this relationship, not just in trust, not just in commitment, but in love, is necessary for the fullness of this relationship.